The sun was only beginning to rise above Fort Lauderdale, yet the runway already shimmered with a silver haze left by the night's coastal rain. Floodlights carved long shadows over the private jets, making them look like sleeping beasts waiting for the sky to wake them. Among the crews moving quietly between hangars, a boy bent low, scrubbing at the landing gear of a Gulfstream G650. His name was Ethan Carter. To most who passed him by, he was nothing more than a janitor's kid with rags in his hands and grease on his jeans. But beneath that worn uniform lived a secret no one cared to notice. Each night, when the other workers dropped their tools, Ethan pored over manuals scavenged from recycling bins, pages filled with diagrams of turbines and bolts. He had no tutor but hunger, no classroom but a dim corner of the dormitory. Still, he dreamed of one thing: to one day stand not as a cleaner of planes, but as the mind who could build and save them. That morning, as he crouched near the wheels, his rag darkened with oil, Ethan froze. From the corner of his eye, a figure appeared by the sleek engine. Granger, the trusted houseman of billionaire Eleanor Whitmore, leaned close, his polished shoes reflecting the lights. He wasn't inspecting, he was working with purpose. Ethan's gaze locked on a small tool glinting in Granger's hand. The man twisted it near the bolts of the engine, his posture sharp, not cautious, but urgent. Then, with a quick glance over his shoulder, Granger slipped the tool back into his pocket and walked away as if nothing had happened. Ethan's heart thundered against his ribs. He knew engines enough to understand what tampering meant. This wasn't maintenance, it was sabotage. He clutched the rag tighter, oil staining his knuckles, his mind torn between silence and truth. Who would ever listen? He was just a boy with no degree, no title, no authority. Worse, he carried the label no one forgave him for: gay, a truth that had cost him his father's roof and left him sweeping floors to survive, against a man in a tailored vest who carried the trust of one of the richest women in America. Ethan was a shadow. Every detail of the moment burned into his mind, the way Granger's fingers moved with intent, the cold glint of metal, the quick look over his shoulder. It was enough to make Ethan tremble. He remembered the nights when people dismissed him with the same sneer: "Oh, nobody with a story." The thought of being laughed at again, of being cast out from even this fragile job, made his chest ache. And yet, as the sleek jet loomed above him, Ethan knew silence meant something far worse than humiliation. Silence meant lives lost, fire tearing across the sky, and guilt that would bury him forever. The runway hummed with routine, but for Ethan, the world had shifted. Every sound, the squeal of wheels, the chatter of crew, faded beneath the pulse of his fear. He stood in the narrow space between anonymity and courage, a place he had been before. He thought of his mother's last words before she was gone from his life, that sometimes the truth is the only light strong enough to pull you from the dark. Those words had kept him alive when rejection had crushed him, and now, standing beneath the belly of a machine worth millions, they struck him again like thunder. Ethan Carter was only a teenager, dismissed by nearly everyone he met. But in that single instant, with the Gulfstream gleaming under the first pale light of dawn and a billionaire's life hanging unknowingly by a thread, he realized that the choice was his alone. Speak up and be ridiculed as the gay janitor who dared accuse a man of power, or hold his tongue and watch disaster unfold before his eyes. The rag slipped from his fingers onto the wet tarmac. His chest rose and fell as though the decision itself was tightening around his throat. He had no allies, no safety net, no one to shield him. Yet deep down, he knew the weight of silence could crush far more than any insult ever would. And so, as the engines of wealth and deceit rumbled around him, Ethan Carter stood trembling, but awake. A boy about to make a choice that would shape not only the morning ahead, but the path of his entire life. Because sometimes, the smallest voice in the loudest place carries the power to change everything. If you believe the truth has the power to rewrite destiny, follow Heart Stories and stay with us for the journey. The ragged chairs in the break room smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee, a place where the laborers gathered between shifts to stretch aching backs in trade jokes that never reached the offices above. Ethan Carter sat on the edge of one, his hands still shaking from what he had seen near the Gulfstream's engine. Words tumbled out of him, uneven and urgent, as he told the others about Granger, the gleam of the tool, the bolts deliberately tampered with. His voice quivered, but his eyes begged to be believed. Laughter broke across the room like glass shattering. One man slapped his knee and said he'd better stop spinning stories before he ended up in trouble. Another warned that accusing someone like Granger was the fastest way to get fired. Their stares carried a weight heavier than mockery. They were stares of dismissal, of judgment already decided. Ethan could almost hear the unspoken label in their silence, just another gay kid stirring up lies to get attention. The rejection wrapped around him like a chain. It wasn't new. He remembered the night his father hurled words sharper than fists, telling him to pack his bag and leave because no son of his would live under the same roof if he dared to admit who he was. That memory still pressed down on Ethan whenever he felt the urge to speak up. It had left him with scars that no one could see, scars that whispered he was better off unseen and unheard. Yet silence felt impossible. Outside, engines warmed and pilots prepared for takeoff. The air buzzed with efficiency, but underneath it, Ethan carried the image of metal twisting loose, of a machine tearing itself apart in midair. He pressed his palms against the table, trying to steady himself. If he stayed quiet, Eleanor Whitmore would climb aboard with full faith in a man who had just betrayed her. The thought made bile rise in his throat. Through the break room window, he spotted the dark SUV rolling smoothly onto the tarmac. Its tinted glass reflected the morning light as it pulled beside the jet. The door opened, and Eleanor Whitmore emerged, elegant in tailored white, her presence radiating command. Beside her, Granger adjusted his cufflinks and guided her with the ease of a man who had earned her trust for years. Ethan's chest clenched. The moment was slipping away, the decision tightening. He thought of his mother's foster words, her soft reminder that truth, no matter how unwelcome, was the only rope strong enough to pull him out of despair. She had been the single voice that once told him he mattered when the rest of the world dismissed him. That memory flickered like a lighthouse now. If he stayed silent, he wasn't just betraying Eleanor, he was betraying himself. Every page of the manuals he had studied, every night spent dreaming of being more than invisible. Still, fear gripped him. The fear of being labeled again, of whispers chasing him across the hangar floor, the gay janitor who cried wolf. Fear that the little he had scraped together would vanish with a single accusation. His body trembled with that inner battle. He longed for someone else to see, someone else to stand beside him. But the truth was his alone to carry. The SUV door closed, and Eleanor began her slow walk toward the steps of the jet. Granger's hand lingered on the handle, his polished smile hiding the secret Ethan had witnessed. The runway stretched wide and indifferent, as though daring him to act. In that suspended moment, Ethan Carter realized that courage often comes disguised as loneliness. He had no allies, no proof beyond what his eyes had caught, but he had a choice to let the weight of fear bury him once again, or to let truth break the silence. No matter the bomb, and sometimes the lesson life whispers is brutal in its clarity, being dismissed hurts, but living with silence can crush the very soul. The roar of engines waiting for clearance shook the air as Ethan Carter pushed through the hangar doors. His legs carried him faster than his mind could reason, sneakers slapping against the wet tarmac. The Gulfstream G650 gleamed ahead, its polished surface reflecting the floodlights. Eleanor Whitmore was halfway up the stairs, her hands steady on the railing, while Granger followed closely behind with the calm composure of a man untouchable. Ethan's chest heaved as if each step might be his last. The security guard stationed nearby shouted for him to stop, his voice sharp against the morning air. But fear of punishment was drowned by something heavier, the knowledge that silence meant catastrophe. With his lungs burning, Ethan lifted his voice against the roar of the engines, against the weight of disbelief that had crushed him moments earlier. "Don't get on the plane." His cry tore through the air, breaking the rhythm of the runway. The engine's been sabotaged. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Eleanor paused mid-step, turning her head toward the sound. The guard lunged forward, gripping Ethan's arm, preparing to drag him away. But before he could be shoved back into the shadows, Eleanor's sharp voice cut through the tension. "Wait," the guard halted. Ethan trembled under her gaze, his breath ragged. His words spilled out, every detail etched into memory: the angle of Granger's body, the shine of the tool, the deliberate twist of his wrist near the bolts. His finger pointed toward the houseman, voice cracking but unyielding. Granger's eyes flickered for only an instant before he composed himself. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pen, holding it up with mock innocence. "I dropped this," he said smoothly. Perhaps the boy saw me retrieve it. His tone was steady, his suit immaculate, his loyalty unquestioned for years. Around them, murmurs stirred among the staff. The balance teetered dangerously: on one side, a billionaire's confidant; on the other, a gay teenager dismissed as a janitor. Yet Ethan's eyes did not waver. There was no theatrics in his trembling stance, only a truth carved deep into his expression. He had nothing to gain, nothing to shield him if he were wrong. And it was that raw certainty that made Eleanor hesitate. For the first time in years, she looked at her trusted houseman and felt doubt creep in. "Call an independent inspection team," she ordered, her voice firm, cutting through Granger's denial. Minutes stretched into eternity as the mechanics worked, flashlights probing the heart of the engine. Ethan stood in silence, hands clenched so tightly his nails cut into his palms. When the lead inspector lifted his head, the verdict landed like thunder. The bolts had been loosened deliberately. The aircraft would have torn itself apart within minutes of takeoff. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. The truth lay bare, undeniable. Granger's face drained of color as uniformed officers moved in, steel cuffs snapping shut around his wrists. His composure shattered as he was led away, no longer the untouchable figure he had been moments earlier. Eleanor's gaze returned to Ethan. For the first time, the boy was no longer invisible. His voice had not only pierced the roar of engines, but had altered the course of that morning. And as Ethan stood trembling under the floodlights, he understood a lesson that life had been trying to teach him all along. Sometimes, the truth does not silence the powerful immediately, but it plants a crack no lie can seal. In choosing to speak, he had risked everything he had left. Yet that single act had saved lives, proving that even the smallest voice can shake foundations when it refuses to break. The runway had quieted after Granger's arrest, but the tension still lingered like static in the humid Florida air. The Gulfstream G650 stood idle, its silver frame glinting under the morning sun. Eleanor Whitmore remained near the base of the stairs, her arms folded, her mind already calculating the consequences of delay. Every hour mattered. A deal awaited her in New York, one that could shift markets and reputations. And yet, her aircraft, her pride and symbol of power, was crippled. The independent inspection team reported the damage with grim precision. The sabotage had weakened essential bolts, misaligned critical parts. It was unsafe to fly, and the specialists estimated it would take at least half a day to bring in replacement staff with the clearance to perform emergency repairs. Eleanor's jaw tightened. To a woman accustomed to having the world bend to her schedule, 12 hours was an eternity. Ethan Carter lingered at the edge of the crowd, his shirt stained with oil, his hands still trembling from the confrontation. He could feel eyes on him, some curious, some skeptical, some resentful that a janitor had shifted the course of the morning. Inside his chest, something flickered, a mix of fear and resolve. He knew these machines not through years of schooling, but through endless nights spent devouring every manual he could find. The diagrams lived in his memory, the mechanics etched into his fingertips. His voice broke the uneasy silence. I could try to fix it." The words drew a wave of muffled laughter. A teenager with a mop offering to repair a multi-million-dollar jet was absurd. A mechanic muttered under his breath that it was reckless. A guard snorted and shook his head, but Eleanor's gaze sharpened, studying Ethan as though weighing not his age or his title, but the unwavering seriousness in his eyes. "Let him," she said finally. The air shifted to ours. Doubt hummed among the workers, but none dared challenge her authority. Ethan stepped forward, his sneakers squeaking against the slick tarmac. He climbed the portable platform, every movement measured, his breath shallow but steady. With hands still marked by labor, he reached for the loosened bolts. The crowd watched, some with disbelief, others with impatience. But Ethan shut out the noise. He focused on the rhythm he had practiced in solitude, the precise turn of a wrench, the careful alignment of steel, the patience to tighten without fracturing. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Sweat traced down his temple, mixing with grease. His knuckles bled slightly where the metal bit into his skin, but he pressed on. He replaced washers, tightened screws, adjusted components until the machine seemed whole again. Then he stepped back, his chest rising as though he had carried the weight of the sky. The mechanic hesitated before pressing the ignition. A low hum filled the air. Then, with a sudden surge, the engine roared to life, steady and flawless. The sound reverberated through the hangar, strong and sure, a voice of triumph. For a moment, silence followed, stunned, disbelieving silence before applause broke out, pattered at first, then swelling until the entire hangar thundered with clapping hands. Eleanor approached, her heels striking sharp against the concrete. She stopped before Ethan, her eyes glistening with something uncharacteristic for a woman so known for her iron composure. She lowered her voice so that only he could hear. "You saved my life twice today, and I will not allow the world to waste a mind like yours." She reached into her bag and drew out a small embossed card, her personal contact. Placing it in his grease-stained hands, she added, "I will fund your education. You will not clean runways forever. You will stand where you belong." Ethan stared at the card as if it were a relic, a key to a door he had never dared to believe would open. His throat tightened, and he clutched it to his chest as though it might vanish. And in that moment, surrounded by the echo of engines and applause, he understood something deeper than victory. Sometimes, the world mocks courage, dismisses dreams, and ridicules the hands that reach for more. But when you persist, when you refuse to shrink beneath contempt, even the greatest barriers can break. A year had passed since that morning on the runway, yet the memory of it still lived in Ethan Carter's chest like a heartbeat that would never fade. He was no longer a boy wiping grease from wheels while others looked past him. Now he walked the halls of the National Institute of Aeronautics, textbooks under his arm, his name etched on the list of the highest performing students. Professors noted his precision. His classmates marveled at the way he seemed to understand engines as if they were extensions of his own breath. He studied until his eyes blurred, worked until his fingers cramped, never forgetting that all of it had been made possible by a single card pressed into his palm by Eleanor Whitmore. It was on a brisk autumn afternoon, when the sound of turbines from the training field echoed across the campus, that Eleanor appeared again. Her arrival drew whispers, students recognizing the woman whose name adorned headlines in business magazines. She moved with her usual air of command, but when she saw Ethan, her smile carried something softer. She motioned for him to join her at the edge of the runway. "You've done well," she said, her eyes shining with something beyond pride. "Better than even I imagined." Ethan lowered his gaze, humbled, still carrying the awe of a boy who once thought himself invisible. Then Eleanor's voice shifted, carrying a weight he hadn't expected. "There is something I never told you," she began. "The day I decided not to turn away from you, I wasn't alone in that choice. My son begged me to give you a chance. He told me not to dismiss you. He told me you reminded him of himself." Ethan blinked, the wind catching his breath. Eleanor's expression softened further. "My son is gay too. He knows what it feels like to be cast aside, to be doubted for simply being who he is. He saw himself in you long before you saw me as your ally." The revelation struck Ethan with the force of truth layered upon gratitude. All this time, he had thought her decision was born solely of his actions that day on the tarmac, yet behind her support was a thread invisible to him, woven by someone he had never met but who shared his same scars. It was not only gratitude that had saved him, but kinship, a bond of identity that stretched beyond bloodlines and wealth. Eleanor placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "You have a family now, Ethan, not because of obligation, but because of recognition. We see you." Tears pricked his eyes as he embraced her, the roar of training engines echoing around them like a chorus. For the first time, Ethan felt not only the weight of survival, but the lightness of belonging. He had once been the boy silenced by shame, then the boy who shouted against disbelief. Now he was the young man who had proven that truth could save lives, and that identity was never a weakness, it was a bridge. As they stood together on the runway, Ethan realized that courage had given him more than opportunity. It had given him connection, a reminder that even when the world dismisses us, there are others waiting to recognize the reflection of their own struggle in ours. And so, the boy who had once cleaned the grease of engines now carried the strength to build them, not just from metal and bolts, but from truth and resilience. Sometimes the bravest act is to raise your voice when silence is safer. Sometimes it is that single cry that changes the course of your life forever. Do you believe the truth can create family where none seem possible? Comment truth below and share your thoughts. And if you want more stories that remind us courage can rewrite destiny, make sure you follow Heart Stories, because here, every story is built to move your heart.